Good afternoon, attendees of this colloquium. I'm Abigail Payne, the Ronald Henderson Professor and Director of the Melbourne Institute Applied Economic and Social Research in the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne. Just shy of a year ago, we started these colloquia as a way to connect with you with our research and insights while we were in lockdown and working from home. Today, I welcome you from my office. For the next while, we will continue to meet virtually. I will, however, look forward to interacting with you in person sometime soon. Let me extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Dr. Jordy Meeks is presenting his work on gender differences in employment, wages, and what might explain gender gaps in Australia. Jordy joined the Melbourne Institute in 2018 as a research fellow. He is also a research affiliate of the IZA Institute of Labour Economics in Bonn, Germany, and a research fellow of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Children's and Families over the life course. Jordy received his PhD from Utrecht University, and during his PhD, he was also a short-stay visiting fellow at MIT in the United States, and his research has included a collaboration with Randstad, holding a human resources company on a study on issues related to temporary and casual work. Jordy will speak for approximately 20 to 25 minutes, followed by a question and answer session with you, the audience. Let me please remind you of a few housekeeping matters. This colloquium is being recorded, and to add your questions or comments, we are relying on the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen for those of you using Zoom. For those of you using Slido, you can submit questions in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation. Please now join me in welcoming Jordy.
Thank you, Abigail, for the kind introduction. My name is Jordy Meeks, and I'm a research fellow at the Melbourne Institute. Very happy to be here, and thanks to all attendees for attending today. So today I will present the colloquium, Does Job Flexibility Impact Gender Gaps in Employment and Wages? This colloquium is based on my recent Melbourne Institute research insight. So I'm affiliated to the LCC and as well to the IZA. So the colloquium plan is as follows. So the main goal is to have a discussion around more effective policies to narrow gender gaps in Australia. And what I will do is I will start with providing an overview of the gender gaps in the Australian and Dutch labour markets. Then based on a recent research paper, I show how women and men are affected by job loss differently. And hopefully we'll learn something from that for explaining gender gaps in today's society. Then we will finish with a moderated Q&A on gender gaps in the labor market together with Abigail. So the motivation of my research is as follows. So a key question is, why are gender gaps in the Australian labor market a problem? And I refer here to a couple of facts from Workplace Gender Equality Agency. So on average, what is going on is that women experience more often missed opportunities to accumulate skills. They have a lower lifetime earnings. They are much more likely to live in poverty, and they have lower superannuation. And one follow-up question would then be, why are gender gaps so pervasive despite gender pay equity and anti-discrimination legislation that has been put into effect over the last decades? And there are many different reasons, and among other things, discrimination is one. So are women discriminated against in their likelihood of becoming employed or to get better career opportunities or promotion opportunities? They are in different types of jobs, but also societal norms play a key role. And one fact is that women spend a higher proportion of time on unpaid housework and childcare. This would leave less time for paid working hours or travel to and from work. And this reduces the likelihood of building a successful career. And in my research conversation article, I argued that in the following context, that why do women get paid less than men? Hours and commuting might provide clues. So what I will do now is to give an overview of the current situation in gender gaps, not only in the labor force participation rate, but also in wages, but also in full-time job probability and the commuting distance. So over here, I present the gender differences in labor market outcomes for Australia. You see on the left column, the country. I show these statistics for women and men, and I show the gap. So the third column is the gross labor force participation rate, which resembles the employed plus the unemployed relative to the total working population. So what you can see here is that about 7 out of 10 women are in the labor force, whether this equals about 8 out of 10 men. So the gender gap in labor force participation rate is 10 percentage points. So out of 100 women, 10 women are less likely to be in the labor force compared to a total number of 100 men. So then we go to the column after, which is the wages. And for Australia, what I use is the so-called AWT, so average weekly ordinary time earnings. This is expressed as a percentage of men's pay. So on average, women experience 15 percentage points or 15% less wages. So this is all based on 2019 financial year data. So gender gaps in employment and in wages are well known. The gender gaps in full-time job and in the commuting distance, well, at least from my perspective, less attention has been paid to those dimensions. And what I show here is that out of 100 women who are employed, only 55 are full-time employed. So about 45 are part-time employed. Whereas for men, this difference is much less. So men have about, out of 100 employed men, 83 are full-time employed. And then there's this gender difference in full-time employment which equals about 28 percentage points. Then I also relate my research to the commuting distance. And what we can find here is that for employed women, the average commute is about 14.2 kilometers, whereas the average commute for men is about 17.7 kilometers. So the gender gap here is about 3.5 kilometers, which resembles a 20% difference. So women are less likely to be in the labor force, earn a lower wage, are less likely to be in a full-time job, and have shorter commutes. And the outcomes related to working hours and commuting distance, this is what I refer to if I talk about job flexibility outcomes. And a full-time job in Australia and in the Netherlands is defined as working more than 35 hours. So now I added 3 more rows for the Netherlands. We have women and men, and again, a gender gap. And we see that the gender gaps in labor market outcomes are about the same for Australia and the Netherlands. So the gender gap in the labor force participation rate for the Netherlands is about 9 percentage points. The gender gap in wages is about 15 percentage points. And I should note here for wages using the Dutch data, I use hourly wages instead of the average weekly ordinary time earnings, which are used for Australia. Then a notable difference is the probability of full-time employment in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is one of the OECD countries with the highest part-time employment rate for women. We see that about 1 out of 4 women are in a full-time job, whereas about 3 out of 4 women in the Netherlands are in a part-time job. For men, it's actually the other way around. So about 3 out of 4 men in the Netherlands are full-time employed, whereas only 1 out of 4 men are part-time employed. So the gender gap in full-time employment is even bigger in the Netherlands. It equals about 48 percentage points. Then we come to the commuting distance. So interestingly, perhaps the commuting distance in the Netherlands is higher than in Australia. What I'm more interested in, not the between country differences, but the within country differences between women and men. So women commute about 20 kilometers and men commute about 25 kilometers. And this again is a 20% difference. So the difference in percentages is about the same. So then we move to the part on my research of how women and men respond to job loss. So what I showed you was that there are gender gaps not only in employment and wages, but also in the job flexibility outcomes, working hours, and commuting. This was also highlighted by the Hilderstedt report of 2019 by Roger Wilkins and co-authors. So women are less likely to have higher paid working hours than men. This is partly explained, of course, by the fact that they have relatively high number of unpaid working hours compared to men. With paid working hours, I refer to working hours in the labor market. So these are paid, and unpaid working hours, you can think of housework and caregiving. Then there is also a key difference in the commuting time from place of home to place of work, also addressed in the Hilderstedt report of 2019. So a key question that came from these differences in job flexibility was, could job flexibility explain gender gaps in employment and earnings? And one way to study this is to look at what happens to women and men after losing their jobs. And this is what we do. Together with Walter Hassink, a paper in the IZA discussion paper series, but also in the Melbourne Institute working paper series. And we do this for the Netherlands. One key benefit of the Netherlands is that we have very rich data. We have these data at the monthly level, so that is why we apply to the Netherlands. What we do is we use a universal reason for job loss, that is job loss because of firm bankruptcy, to ensure unemployment does not depend on personal characteristics. So women are more likely to give up their job, for example, for family reasons. Men are more likely to be fired on the spot, and we don't want these different reasons for unemployment. That's why we focus on only one reason for unemployment, and that is job loss due to firm bankruptcy. So then what we did was we limited the sample to about 61,000 treated workers and about 113,000 control workers with a job tenure of at least 3 years who had worked at least 20 hours a week before job loss. So let me explain what a treated worker is and a control worker. So the treated worker is the so-called displaced workers, so workers experiencing job loss because of firm bankruptcy. And control workers are found by matching on observables. So for one treated worker, we find a control worker who is observationally equivalent. So you can think of a worker who has the same age, who's working in the same economic sector, who has the same full-time, part-time worker status, etc. So we end up with a sample of about 61,000 plus 113,000 workers. And we study the impact of job loss and employment, hourly wages, paid working hours, and commuting distance from 2 years before until 3 years after job loss. And as mentioned before, we have monthly data based on the monthly income statements of the worker, so we can nicely track the impact of job loss over time. So then I come to the first key result, which is the gender employment gap after job loss. So on the y-axis, we have percentage points, the impact in percentage points. It ranges from -40 to 40 percentage points. Women are in the dark blue, men are in the light gray, and I show the impact 6 months after job loss and 36 months after job loss. And this impact is identified by comparing women who experienced job loss, compared them in the outcome of employment to women who were alike but who didn't experience job loss because of firm bankruptcy. And what I find is that after 6 months since job loss, the impact for women who experience job loss is about 40 percentage points on employment. So they are 40 percentage points less likely to be in employment after 6 months. This equals only 17 percentage points after 36 months. Then for men, the impact is about 31 percentage points. So roughly speaking, after 6 months, out of 100 men who became unemployed due to job loss, about 69 became re-employed after 6 months, and 87 became re-employed by 36 months after job loss. Then the key insight here is that it takes longer for women to become re-employed than men. So the gender employment gap after job loss equals 18 percentage points after 6 months since job loss, and this narrows down to 4 percentage points after 3 years since job loss. Then we move on to the impact on hourly wages. So again, the y-axis now is the same from -40 to 40, but now we're talking about percentage changes. The impact of job loss on women after 6 months is -4%. So compared to the hourly wage they made before, they experienced a 4% lower wage after 6 months and a 6% lower hourly wage after 36 months. Then a key insight here is that men lose more in hourly wages. So men lose 6% after 6 months and 8% after 36 months. So what you also see is that the loss in hourly wages accumulates a bit over time and becomes bigger. So one important note here is that we only identify the impacts on hourly wages, on working hours and commuting distance for workers who are re-employed at that moment in time. And what I show in the paper is that the difference in the impact over time is especially caused by workers who become re-employed later over the period. So another way to put that is workers who are longer unemployed after job loss, they experience the highest hourly wage loss. So what we find here is that the gender hourly wage gap after job loss actually narrows. It doesn't widen, it narrows, but only slightly. Then we get to the gender paid hours gap after job loss. Percentage changes. What we observe here is for women after 6 months, they experience an 80% drop in working hours compared to the working hours they had before. After 36 months, this difference equals about 11%. For men, the impact equals 13% after 6 months. And after 36 months, after 3 years, it will be 6%. So the gender gap in paid hours after job loss equals about 5 percentage points. And this 5 percentage points is found both 6 months and 36 months after job loss. Then we go to commuting. And yeah, personally, I'm always interested in the commuting distance because it's also, it relates to job flexibility in a way. And I think everyone would agree that a shorter commute is always better, whereas fewer worker hours or higher working hours, that can be a preference as well. So the impact for women after 6 months since job loss equals 15%. So compared to women who didn't become unemployed, women who did become unemployed, they experienced a 15% increase in commute after 6 months, but only a 2% increase after 36 months. So what this is telling us is that women who tend to be longer unemployed, they accept shorter commutes. So for them, the impact on commuting distance after 36 months is close to 0. For men, on the other hand, we observe a consistent increase in commuting distance after job loss because of firm bankruptcy. So after 6 months, the increase equals about 26%. And after 36 months, the increase in commuting distance equals about 14%. And important to note here, perhaps, is commuting distance is defined by the distance from place of home to place of work. Then to sum, the key things we learned from these figures are as follows. After experiencing job loss, women tend to remain unemployed longer. They experience a slightly smaller hourly wage loss. They work fewer hours in their new job. And they tend to be less likely to commute longer distances for work compared to men who became unemployed because of job loss, because of firm bankruptcy. Then one interpretation of these results is that the cost of job flexibility for female workers come through longer unemployment in the short term, and possibly through missed opportunities, also lower hourly wages in the long run. But in the study of until 3 years after job loss, we do not observe that the gender hourly wage gap widens. And there are 2 other key results that I would like to touch upon. The first one is for the difference between workers who work part-time before job loss and the difference between workers who work full-time before job loss. And the other relates to the so-called child penalty effect. So what I showed was that except for hourly wages, gender gaps widened in all outcomes after job loss. However, men who worked part-time before becoming unemployed took longer to secure a job than men who previously worked full-time and who became unemployed. And part-time employed men fared worse in terms of hourly wages. So what I actually found was that part-time working men who experienced job loss, they experienced a 10% reduction in hourly wages. So the biggest reduction in hourly wages of all 4 groups: part-time employed men, part-time employed women, full-time employed women and full-time employed men. So this suggests a negative signal to part-time work for men, but not for women. And this could be explained by the fact that it is much less common for men to work part-time, whereas it is very common for women to work part-time. So there could be a negative signal to future employers of hiring someone who worked part-time before job loss. Then the other key effect related to the child penalty effect. So the child penalty effect is that after giving birth for the first time, women tend to experience reductions in labor market outcomes, especially in pay and as well in working hours. So what we studied was the impact of job loss and pregnancy at the same time. And what we found was that the negative effect of job loss on unemployment and working hours is amplified for pregnant women, but not for expectant fathers. And the negative impact on employment and working hours for expectant mothers was even found after 3 years since job loss, and particularly for women who worked full-time before job loss. So with amplified, I mean we have the default child penalty effect that is common in the literature. But if women are pregnant and experience job loss because of firm bankruptcy, they experience even worse outcomes over the 3 years since job loss. Then I come to the policies to narrow gender gaps. So a more provocative statement perhaps is that there can be unintended effects of policies. So inclusion policies and flexible work arrangements designed to support gender equity in employment may actually weaken women's careers and lifetime earnings. Why? Well, it facilitates women to take leave and to become part-time employed. It stimulates the gender difference from the onset of being a parent in time spent in paid employment and unpaid housework. So women tend to spend less time in paid employment and more time in unpaid housework and childcare. Then on top of that, it limits opportunities to accumulate skills and experiences because women then have fewer working hours. And it encourages traditional division of responsibilities within the household. So what's striking for me is that so far much of the policy discussion is always on how to narrow gender gaps is always about changes for women and not for men. And together with Leah Rupener, also from the University of Melbourne, a associate professor in sociology, we had this conversation article on flexible work arrangements help women, but only if they're also offered to men. And that's a bit the point I would like to make. Increasing men's access to parental leave might be a promising avenue. And this is already done in Sweden, for example, in Germany through a so-called daddy quota. And a daddy quota means that parents get parental leave, but a specific amount of parental leave is reserved for the father only. And if the household doesn't take this parental leave, it will be gone. So Sweden started with a daddy quota of 1 month, and at this stage it's at 3 months. And the initial evidence on that was that it increases the probability of men taking parental leave. In the longer term, it should help women to by motivating men to take a parental leave. This might persuade men to spend more time on housework and caregiving. Thereby, it would reduce the pressure on women to spend a lot of time on unpaid working, and it would allow them to remain active in the paid labor market. So for Sweden, the authors didn't find any long-term positive effects on the employment outcomes of women, but in Germany, there was evidence that it did help. So men taking more parental leave and longer parental leave, they found the effect that the mothers were more likely to have more employment and higher wages after a couple of years since giving birth. So in the Netherlands, I just wanted to briefly mention they just increased the parental leave for fathers as well. So we can perhaps expect some research on that over the next years. Then ING Australia made parental leave available to all parents equally. And I wanted to highlight that because it's not only government playing an important role, but also employers playing an important role in reducing gender gaps. And with gender gaps, I would then not mean only gender gaps in employment and hourly wages, but also gender gaps in paid working hours, unpaid working hours, and perhaps the commuting distance as well. So promoting flexible working arrangements for men is another promising avenue, but we should be aware of this potential negative signal to part-time work for men. And again, this is where employers are important because they are responsible for hiring new employees. Then my last slide is on COVID-19, maybe of course, but there can be a silver lining. How did the COVID-19 pandemic affect the gender gaps? Again, Leah Rupener and the co-authors showed that Australian fathers increased childcare and housework contributions. Internationally, though, I would like to mention that men increased indeed time spent on housework, but women by more. Leah found that men spent more time on housework, and this might put off pressure in the longer term on women, putting a lot of time on housework and childcare. And this could help in reducing gender gaps in the future. Then another key change was the substantial increase in working from home, but we need to see whether it is here to stay, because I think I just read on the news that we are allowed to have 100% of the employees back in the office from this Friday onwards. But working from home might make it easier for men and women to balance home and work life. And finally, I would like to mention some COVID-19 research of myself. And there are a lot of other key outputs are on this personal website. So two key results were: first, single parent employees experience large negative outcomes in the Dutch labor market. So we found that together with Walter Hassink from Utrecht University and Guillaume Kalp from the Melbourne Institute, what we found was that parents did quite well in the labor market. So we interpret that as they were good in taking care of both children and work. But single parents, it's only up to the single parents to care for the children. We showed some larger negative effects on their employment and working hours outcomes. Then also together with Guillaume Kalp is the Melbourne Institute Research Insight 3220 of last year, where we find that especially there were negative COVID-19 impacts on employment for women in regional Australia. And the regional metro Melbourne, you could say, a metro area, there's of course a key difference in the economic structure of these areas. And one potential explanation was that hospitality was hit hardest in regional Australia, and therefore, women are more likely to work in hospitality. But it might be a policy target to especially support women in regional Australia. Okay, then I would like to leave it with that, and I look forward to the policy discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jordi. Let me remind everyone that if you have a question or a comment, to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the right-hand panel of your Slido. I'm going to start first with the question around your comparisons of what your study is using Netherlands data versus Australian data. So the question is really, given there are different institutional and labor market policy frameworks in the Netherlands, how do you think that those differences may apply to findings and what it might mean for Australia?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The generalizability to Australia is, of course, difficult to make. And I would encourage people to research it also for Australia. One thing, though, to mention here, Social Security is relatively good in both the Netherlands and Australia. What I try to set the stage with comparable gender gaps in both countries in terms of the labor force participation rate, wages, working hours, and commuting distance. But I agree with the question that it's not a one-on-one generalizability. So I would encourage people to research it also in Australia.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question is that this participant has heard that merely making parental leave available to men does little to change uptake in parental leave. So is it the function of making the leave available or the uptake that might actually make a difference in what you were talking about in terms of your potential policy implications?
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. And I feel there are two key ways to make a change there. Well, first, of course, there should be access for any uptake. Then this relates a lot to the societal norms, which might need to change to make it more common also for men to use this access and to thereby encouraging men to take it. Yeah, and the last important stakeholder here are the employers, I feel. So if employers actually encourage men to make use of these facilities, like I had the impression that ING Australia is doing this, this might help a lot, but it will take a lot of time. That's at least my guess.
Okay, great. So I'm going to add a question and then I will move back to some of the questions we have. So in your analysis around looking at gender gaps, whether it's wages or the gaps around really what your analysis is getting at, the job loss, are you able to control for occupation type? So essentially, do you see differences in the gender gaps based on the nature of the occupation of men and women?
So the occupation, that's one of the key limitations of the Dutch data. It's not in the data. So what we do because of that is economic sector, and we take into account education differences. So that's one key way to touch upon this. But I agree occupation is important, but after controlling for economic sector, a lot of the variation of differences between men and women into the selection into specific industries or specific occupations is taken into account.
Great. So kind of related, that is one of our participants would like to know a little bit more around the controls you're using in your models to investigate the gender wage gap.
Yeah, I can look them up. So what I do is, so first we have a set of controls. So we have the so-called treated workers who experience job loss because of firm bankruptcy. And we have the control workers who experience no job loss because of firm bankruptcy, but they can experience job loss for any other reason. So then we match them. So we make them observationally equivalent. We do this by integrating a lot of variables, including the age, including the economic sector, as I mentioned before. Yeah, I would refer back to the IZ8 paper, probably that's easiest. So the full list of matching variables is included over there. The full list of covariates in the regression analysis is also in there. Yeah, what I showed today, maybe that helps a bit, was just the differences between control women versus treated women in the outcome. In the paper, what we do is more advanced framework where we include everyone in the same model, also men. So then we go from a double differences model to a triple differences model. And we also include the relevant triple interaction terms between all these covariates as well, like age group, economic sector, full-time, part-time status before job loss. I think that would help the person who asked this question. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so follow up on that. The question is, understanding that you use propensity score matching, so this is more technical, did you also employ Oaxaca decompositions in your analysis? So you can keep that answer relatively quick.
Well, I didn't apply the Oaxaca decomposition method, but one thing to note here is I also didn't apply propensity score matching. So what we do is coarsened accept matching. So we don't need to calculate the p-score, which should be the probability of experiencing job loss because of firm bankruptcy, and then matching controls to treated based on the p-score. But what we do is we just look at the observables, and this is possible because we have so many potential control workers. We just like in full population, so in the millions of people, and we only include an individual who experienced job loss if we match her or him to an individual who didn't experience job loss if they are completely identical in all observables. So the same age group, the same gender, the same economic sector, the same full-time, part-time status before job loss, etc.
Okay, great. That's probably one of the values of being able to work with large sample sizes is that you can narrow your comparison. Next question is, has any gender and labor market research been done on gender diverse people? those who do not identify exclusively as women or men. And follow-up is, do you even know if the data are available to study the question in that context?
Yeah, that's another great question. To the best of my knowledge, or I'm not aware of studies in the close field I'm in. I am sure, though, that there are studies on this topic. It is a great suggestion for potential future research, and perhaps especially when, so this is my dream, for example, of in Australia, and this also relates to the previous question. If this access would become available in Australia, like I have now in the Netherlands, if we then also could link it to survey data, you can really touch upon this question, I think, in a very nice way. And it's an important question.
So I can say that I believe in the next round of Australian census data is that a question is going to be fielded around gender identity that might be able to get at that. Okay, so now I'm going to go big picture. So COVID-19, you obviously have written a little bit around what's going on in Australia and COVID-19, but I want to put this in a slightly different context. So if I understand your study correctly, what you've, in terms of gender gaps and job losses, I would walk away thinking that when women may find it harder relative to men to get a job, after a job loss, that they experience fewer hours after the job loss, but that in terms of gaps, while they may experience lower wages, that the gap with men is actually men are experiencing much lower wages than women, and that in terms of commuting, women seem to be more successful in obtaining new jobs that have relatively the same commuting distances. So some exacerbate the gender gap and some reverse the gender gap or a different way. So in many countries, and folks think it is true in Australia as well, the recession that was caused by the pandemic is believed to be more of a female or women-oriented recession relative to prior recessions. And so I kind of want to say, if you think about this COVID recession resulting in job losses, and that a greater proportion of women are experiencing those job losses, what do you think, if you had a crystal ball, what do you think this might mean in terms of our understanding of gender gaps? Will they get worse or better?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this is a good moment to touch upon the question, are women actually hit worse? So yeah, worse than men. This relates strongly to the paper that I have with Guillaume Kalp and Walter Hazen, again on the Dutch data, but I think this is a critical point to start from. So we have essential or frontline workers and non-frontline workers. So actually women are much more likely, in the Dutch setting at least, but I'm pretty sure it's also in Australia, women are much more likely to be a frontline worker. And frontline workers were much less likely in experiencing negative effects from COVID-19 in terms of labor market outcomes, I mean here. But then on the other hand, we have the non-essential workers. And over there, we do find with the Dutch data that women are hit worst compared to men in terms of labor market outcomes. So if there is a group who are particularly worse off in the context of COVID-19, it's women who are not frontline workers. So yeah, the COVID-19 shock put a lot of pressure on both women and men, I feel. And for some groups more mothers, and for some groups the fathers. Like if there is a couple where the mother is a frontline worker, yeah, the partner needs to take care of the children if there are children in our household. But I feel that's an important thing. So it's not that the entire group of women is worse off and the entire group of men is not worse off. I feel there's a lot of heterogeneity effects. This again asks for more detailed data where you can really zoom in which groups are actually very worse off. I think households with younger children, that's what we found in the Dutch paper again. But we can also touch upon this with taking the pulse of the nation data that we have. People with young children, they had the most difficulties in taking care of home and work life. And then what we found was especially single parents were worse off, but both men and women.
Okay, great. I gave you a super challenging question, and that was a great answer. Thank you, Jordy. So I think we have time for one last question, and it's going to be, do you think that the gender difference in geographical distance could be influenced by women being less likely to find jobs further from their place of residence due to less transport flexibility and or for childcare reasons, such as having to pick up children or taking them to childcare?
Yeah, I think this is another great question. So in my mind, when I think about commuting distance, what I do is just from home to workplace. Ideally, we would like to know who's taking care of putting the children at school, and then include this distance in the distance of women's commuting distance, for example. So I do agree, indeed, think that the gender difference in geographical distance could be influenced by women being less likely to find jobs further from their place of residence due to transport flexibility or childcare reasons. But again, then I would like to make the point that, so I showed you the gender gap in paid working hours, gender gap in unpaid working hours, and the gender gap in computing. And this all relates to the fact that women are much more likely to be the ones responsible for taking care of the household. And if this change, also the gender commuting gap should narrow over time, and also the probability of men, bringing their children to school or picking them up, this probability of men doing this should also be a bit higher. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jordy. So this time has flown by. So it's time for us to wrap this up. So thank you very much, Jordy, for a great talk and a great answering a whole range of questions on the policy relevance of this research. I hope everyone in the audience have enjoyed this colloquia, and I look forward to seeing you at our next colloquium on April 20th. Where Associate Professor John-Se Young and Dr. Wu Yang will be presenting on the topic of do market forces in aged care lead to better outcomes. We are popping into the chat function a link so that you can register for the next colloquium. But you can also always go to our website, melbourneinstitute.com, to find out about our upcoming events. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Jordy.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Abigail.